I don't often get into pilgrim country, so you'll have to forgive me if I don't know some of the local folklore here. I understand the only successful demonstration you people in Massachusetts ever held where you dressed up as Indians. And I understand your town is named after one of our favorite people, huh? Jeffrey Amherst, who distributed smallpox blankets to the Indians in the Ohio Valley. Of late, I've picked up theological and anthropological critics because of my attacks on them. So to shorten the questioning period considerably, I'll make some preliminary remarks on those two brands of humanity, and then they won't have to ask me questions afterwards. We've had an ongoing battle with anthropologists for a number of years, revolving around two basic concepts, one of which is that they continue to act as if the only valid Indians were the first Indians that one of the anthropologists ran across. And everyone born since is somehow not quite an Indian because he doesn't conform to their scholarly opinions. And so we've had a running battle with them on that account. At the present time, there are very strained relationships between a number of tribes and museums, where various anthropologists have gathered the sacred objects, medicine bags, things pertaining to Indian religions, and they've kept them in these museums in an effort to educate the school children of this country as to the great American heritage. And we've had battles in the state of New York over the Iroquois wampum belts. The Smithsonian changes their exhibits every time a tribe starts into the museum because they have some sacred masks of the Zunis that they want to display, but they don't want the Zunis to know they have them. And so you get some very frantic anthropologists running around there. Now, I don't say that these people are all bad. I wouldn't want my sister or daughter to marry one, but we found a place for them now in modern society, and that is working on the population explosion. Because if they teach sex education the way they teach anthropology, everybody's going to lose interest. And that problem will be shortly solved. Speaking in the East, you don't run into people of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. You speak out West, half your audience is generally people from the Bureau of Indian Affairs coming to see if you're telling the truth about them so they can report back to the area office what you said and try and get you in trouble with your tribe. For most of you, probably the Bureau of Indian Affairs is a very obscure, esoteric government agency. I taught at Western Washington State last fall, and the students had a big demonstration to protest the Amchitka atomic explosion. I went out in the square where we had the rally, and the students were telling me that shooting off this bomb would cause tidal waves and earthquakes. They said there's no place on earth that's safe to set that bomb off. And I said, yeah, there's one place, that's the Bureau of Indian Affairs, because nothing's going to shake that institution. But I've done some research on the Bureau of Indian Affairs lately, and I've come up with the answer, and that is that before General Custer went to the Little Bighorn, he stopped by the Bureau and said, don't do anything till I get back. We like to refer to it as a hotbed of inertia. Now, 10 years ago, these were our chief enemies. And over the last 10 years, I think we made considerable progress against the Bureau. about 3 years ago, I think most of you finally became aware of Indians when Indian activists took over Alcatraz, and then we had a series of activist groups out west landing on islands. I went out about 2 weeks after we took Alcatraz and talked to some of the people out there. We tried to set up some lobbyists in Washington so we could get control of the island. And I went back to Washington, D.C. in January, tried to talk to people in the Nixon administration about getting the island for an Indian cultural center. And I ran into one very conservative Republican who shook his finger at me and he said, "You get those Indians out of that prison or we're going to put them in jail." I never could get the logic to that, but any group that put Rehnquist on the Supreme Court is not terribly logical to begin with. In recent years, I'd say the end of 71 and 72, Indians appear to have gone out of the fad stage as far as the media goes. I know New York Times and some others still think Chief Red Fox is a 101-year-old Sioux Indian. None of us ever did, but the New York Times and several others who really could not face the problems of modern Indians, in effect went out and created one that was 100 years old that they could reminisce with. I talked to one anthropologist who had entered anthropology because when he was 8 years old, he went to Cleveland, Ohio, and Chief Red Fox was advertising sausages. And he was so impressed with Chief Red Fox, he decided to devote his life to preservation of Sioux culture. And I think that's the starting position of most people entering anthropologists in one traumatic, charismatic moment where they spy another culture. Now, I think the reason that Indians appear to have lost the attention of the media and are not the favorites of Time and Newsweek anymore is that in large measure we've accomplished a great many things that we wanted to accomplish in the last 10 years. At the beginning of the Kennedy administration, we had a great many very powerful political enemies in Washington, D.C. These people were, for the most part, determined to stamp out all Indian culture, all Indian treaty rights. They would always come to the reservation to have a war bonnet put on them at election time. The minute the election was over and you went in and tried to talk with them, why, you were immediately faced with another General Custer or Jeffrey Amherst. Over the last 10 years, a number of Indian tribes have become very active in political events in the West. I'm happy to tell you that 2 weeks ago we retired Wayne Aspinall of Colorado. Clinton Anderson of New Mexico got too old to dodder around Interior. We've gotten rid of a lot of staff men who used to be very anti-Indian. We are not going to apparently play a very big role in the 1972 presidential election. If you read the latest poll, Richard Nixon's now ahead by 39 points. One old Indian told me a society always gets what it deserves, and that's why Nixon is that far ahead. Now, I don't want to explain that remark. The emphasis has shifted rather dramatically from activist events. Following Alcatraz, we had a group land on Fort Lawton, which is a fort in Seattle that was about to be declared surplus. We had a group land at the lighthouse in Milwaukee. They were thinking of taking over the Milwaukee Yacht Club, but they didn't have enough men to occupy both places. I asked them why they wanted to take over the Milwaukee Yacht Club. They said they wanted to have red suns in the sail set. But we now have a Indian culture school at the old lighthouse site in Milwaukee. It's funded through health, education, welfare funds. And it's one of about 5 or 6 Indian cultural schools in urban areas that came about as a direct result of the activism. Now, if you look at the events of those 3 activist years, almost everything that happened revolved around the concept of land. And it was not simply clarifying titles to land, but it was Indian people trying to get specific pieces of land in order to set up cultural centers, Indian study centers, spiritual centers. And even though these protests were somewhat symbolic, they were able to communicate with Richard Nixon and other people in the current administration so that we were able to break through in the last 2 years and get a great many things that we'd been trying to get for over a period of 50 years. Since 1962, the Indian Claims Commission had ruled that the Blue Lake belonged to Taos Pueblo and the United States should return the lake. The senior Democrats in Congress refused to pass legislation that would return that lake to us. Finally, the White House entered. I hate to be giving Nixon credit for this, but he did put a lot of muscle on the Republican Party. The bill went to the floor of the Senate, where they had a very vicious fight over the concept of restoring sacred lands to Indians. The administration bill carried by a wide majority, and approximately 48,000 acres of sacred land that was sacred to Taos Pueblo was transferred to them. Since then, we've gotten 12,000 acres that included Mount Adams in the state of Washington, which was a shrine of the Yakama Indians of that state. Last Thursday, the Nixon administration returned 61,000 acres to the Warm Springs tribe of Oregon. And they're presently writing up a bill to give the Tono Apaches an 85-acre reservation in Arizona, recognize them as a federal tribe. And these were major items on the Indian agenda at the beginning of the 1960s. Almost everything that you would read or hear about in relationship to the contemporary Indian problem revolved around the concept of land restoration. Now, through the 50s and up to 1966, it was extremely difficult for us to advocate and communicate the desire to restore tribal lands, particularly tribal lands that had sacred shrines on them. And I believe the reason that it was difficult is that when you come into the value structure of American Indian people, you're talking about religious and philosophical ideas that are directly opposed to Western culture, to Christianity, and the whole tradition of the West. And consequently, raising the issue of sacred lands appears in one context politically. When you transfer the ideas behind that over into another context, I think you find the American Indians stand directly opposed to the interpretations of what this world is that have been shared by non-Indian people of the United States. And this involves the concept of death, the concept of creation, the concept of animal and plant life, the concept of what the universe consists of. I think what you're seeing at the present time in the virtual disappearance of Indian activism is the beginning of a struggle on a very new level. That is, a lot of activists who had, up to this time, been rather content to land on islands, address audiences on the subject of racism and Third World Revolution. A lot of these people have dropped out of the activist movement. They're back on the reservations and they're studying under the religious and holy men of the tribe. A lot of the ceremonies are being renewed. There's a tremendous sweeping undercurrent going through Indian country that involves traditional religion. I think this will surface in 4 or 5 years, and I think this time, instead of a civil rights movement starting on the basis of equality with the dual problems of segregation, integration, community power, all of the things that we've experienced in the last 20 years, that you're going to see a whole new phenomenon of social questions raised. And as I say, I don't think it'll be for another 5 years. I think what we're seeing now in this lull is people storing psychic energy in their emotional batteries, getting ready for another run at an attempt to define what America is. Now, if you look into religious and political traditions of the European white man as he's coming over here, you find that this man for 1,500 years has been in a religion that taught him that the original man on earth bit into an apple and thereby damned creation, all of the life species of creation, all of the men who could ever live in that creation. The religion taught him that the universe was completely alien to him. He had no relationship with it whatsoever. For 1,500 years, Christians proclaimed they were in the world but not of it. Consequently, no responsibility was ever felt to the world. Since the interest in Indians has come along, you can go into any bookstore and get thousands of anthologies. And they usually put Chief Joseph's surrender speech right in the middle of the book because that's always the high point of the anthology. Your early selections continually speak of the paradise that existed on this continent and how stunned the early explorers were that Indian tribes kept treaties without demanding a piece of paper to take into a law court. They had no jails, no orphanages. That in a great many ways, Indian society was almost a Garden of Eden society. It is not, and of course cannot be that today, because we are so involved with a number of things we've had to adapt to so many forces from the outside. But in the original concept, as the original explorers found the American Indian tribes, that religion emphasized the unity of life, the kinship of all living species to one another. Over a period of 300 years, the continent was systematically settled, in many instances almost totally destroyed, and in many ways irredeemably destroyed. If you go to the Appalachian Mountains today, you realize no matter how many ads Peabody Coal and Kennecott Copper run in Time magazine, that land will never be the same. As you look through the various anthologies, you find over and over again the various Indian tribes say we cannot sell this land because this land contains the bones of our fathers and grandfathers. This is where our spirits are. This is where our people have always been. You find throughout these anthologies various Indian chiefs saying that we cannot sell this land because you have to dig down 3 feet before you reach the earth, because the rest of this is the dust of our ancestors. In 1926, Luther Standing Bearer of the Sioux tribe predicted there would be continual psychic disruptions, continual conflict, and continual confusion. Because he said the white man can never dig his roots into the soil of this land and take root. In the Christian religion, you're taught that there is physical resurrection of the body. Consequently, when you die as a Christian, your body is put in a waterproof, airproof, rust-proof casket, stuck into a ground, and a stone is put there, waiting the day of the second coming. And at no point is there any intention that you or your spirit or your body become part of the land. But you're segregated in a cemetery very close to the church so the devil can't get your spirit, and in every way possible your bodies are preserved so that they'll be ready for the resurrection. And consequently, there is no point in the Christian religion in which the people can relate to the land at all, that they are continually alienated from the land. And what we have fought for the last 10 or 15 years is to bring this Indian concept of religion into the courts, into public consciousness, into the intellectual struggle to define modern America. Because there's a substantial number of Indian people that think this is not only a vital concept, it's a crucial concept for contemporary America. Because what we have going on at the present time, and you can go into almost any state and see this, the Christian concept of man alienated from nature has been given a beneficial veneer, and that is called tax exemption or tax deductible items. So that land in this society and the animals and plants living on it have value for this society insofar as you can put them on your income tax form every year. Depreciation of land. Land's a good investment if you capitalize, amortize, and go through all of these other things that you go through. And a great many people own land and never see it, because what they see is a piece of paper that describes the location of this thing. And consequently, there is no way in present-day America for a community or even a very small group of individuals to relate to any particular piece of land. And where no one can relate to it, what has been a very beneficial concept of individual ownership becomes a very demonic thing. Because what law then does is protect one man's right to use his land to the detriment of everybody else in that society. I didn't realize how drastic the situation was till I went down in Appalachia this last spring. When the coal companies get through with Kentucky, all you're going to have is the Kentucky Derby grounds and the interstates going through the state, and everything else will have been strip mined. Kentucky was once one of the most beautiful places on earth. In the far west, we're fighting a very drastic fight against the Interior Department simply to allow the wild animals to live on federal lands. Some of the newspaper items that you frequently come across are these battles out there to allow the Mustang and Maverick horses that run through Wyoming and Utah, to allow them to live one more year as wild animals, as animals who have a right to exist. Against that are the combined forces of the stockmen, the cat and dog food manufacturers, the oil companies who want to get into the shale. And here you're opposing two different ideas. An Indian concept of creation, that a living being or a living species has the right to exist in and of itself, and not because it is economically feasible for another species or because it happens to fit into an overall plan of development. Department of Interior every year puts a substantial budget into what they call predator control. If you walk through the Rocky Mountains today, you don't hear the voice of any living thing. The only thing that you will occasionally hear is a jet plane going overhead or a superhighway in the distance. And predator control is based on a mythological interpretation of what Internal Revenue calls depreciation and allowable losses. Wyoming and Colorado, parts of Montana and Utah used to have considerable wildlife on them. The Internal Revenue Code was changed to allow sheepmen and cattlemen to deduct losses taken by predators every year. I don't know how long ago that was, but no cow or sheep has died a natural death in those 4 states ever since that section went in. Because if a sheep would die a natural death in Wyoming, it could not be deducted from income tax. If the sheep is killed by a mythological eagle, then it becomes a tax-deductible loss and is carried on the books to be balanced against income. Over the last 20 years, you have the number of sheep in Wyoming going down, the number of lambs killed going up, and the number of eagles killed going up. So the story is that there's one eagle out there someplace that's averaging something like 1,000 lambs a day. The current move toward ecology and attempting to build a new type of social understanding of what we're talking about in social movement. In this last year, I've been in a number of political controversies, and at almost every point we have conservationists pitted against minority groups, conservationists pitted against the rural poor. We have the Corps of Engineers and the Bureau of Reclamation standing back and choosing sides between the people involved in the controversy and ending up getting their programs put through regardless of what the ultimate value of the project is. And consequently, it is not going to be easy to come out of the post-civil rights, post-Vietnam protest days and talk about coalitions for social movement that are based on what are really old concepts. And that is that you stack all of the interest groups on one side of the scale and hope you get 51%, and if you get 51%, you think you can carry it politically. But what you're talking about is the emergence of fundamentally opposed views. That is the traditional Western view that nature is dead, that nature is bad, that man is an alien in this world. And what is basically the American Indian view that nature is alive, that nature is good, and that we don't care whether there's another world or not, we're too busy occupied finding out what this one is. And I think these are the 2 points of view that inevitably must come out of all the social confusion that we see today. We've had sporadic instances of women's liberation movements in the Indian country. In many traditional tribes, it's the men who need liberation and not the women in Indian country. Many tribes, the clan mothers choose who will be the leaders, they choose who will be the religious leaders, they make almost all of the decisions that the tribe makes. Women's liberation is a concept that Indian people can relate to, but relate to in a far different cultural context. Because in our tribal histories, the various distinctions that are made within the Indian community are definite definitions of roles. There is not a primary interpretation which is either masculine or feminine in there, but more of a cooperative, communal sense. Consequently, it's very difficult to begin to lay the guidelines for what a lot of us think could be the social movements of the 70s. In 1954, the Supreme Court came down with Brown versus Topeka Board of Education, which was the primary case that laid the groundwork, at least legally and politically, for the civil rights movement. In that same year, Congress passed something like 14 termination acts and began systematically destroying the tribes of this country. Throughout the early 60s, we were talking about the necessity of developing new concepts of what capital is, and what capital can do for communities. I recently did a study on the Lummi tribe of Western Washington. The Bureau of Indian Affairs set up that reservation in 1872. It was 12,000 acres of virgin cedar wood, the best cedar on the West Coast. The Bureau of Indian Affairs, at the direction of the President of the United States in 1872, cut and burned the forest because everyone knew that the Indians had to become farmers like the rest of America. Once the forest was cut and burned, they taught the Indians how to plant potatoes. No one ever told anybody in Washington, D.C. that the average rainfall is something like 45 inches a year in western Washington. And for 9 months a year, the minute you remove that tree cover, what you're talking about is a swamp. In every 10-year period in the history of that tribe, you can see some directive come out of Washington, D.C. If you trace the ideology back, the ideology goes back to the inevitability of Western history that certain groups of people should do certain things. We have to prepare these people to live good Christian lives so that in the afterlife they can have equal civil rights where we cannot give it to them now. All of the other mythologies that have always defined America. Out of that 12,000 acres, by 1962, the Lummi tribe had as its sole asset 500 acres of tidal flats. The tidal flats, as some of you know, is the land exposed between high and low tide. It's hardly a place that you can put a motel. Bureau of Indian Affairs came in and took a look at the Lummi Reservation, decided in the way of Western cultures that 1,600 Lummis should start arts and crafts projects because Indians are good with their hands. We can create a tremendous industry here to help these people adjust to modern life. So they loaned the tribe $30,000. They created the Lummi knitters, the Lummi weavers, and the Lummi carvers. The Bureau of Indian Affairs ran the program for 6 years. The most successful component was the Lummi knitters. The women worked all year round and they averaged $272 a year income. The other programs were much worse. The Lummi carvers averaged $15 a year income per person. After 6 years, the Bureau of Indian Affairs threw up their hands, issued a paper blasting the Lummis as lazy, unmotivated, dirty, ignorant Indians that they would never have anything to do with under any circumstances. The Bureau of Indian Affairs people began a boycott of the Lummi Reservation. And the minute they were gone, the Lummis rushed up to Western Washington State and they said, why don't you people come down and take a look at this, what we've got left, and tell us what to do. Marine biologists came down, took one look at it, and they said, well, I suppose you could set up an aquaculture if you really would like to do that. The Lummis, being traditional fishermen, started discussing the idea, decided to attempt to build an aquaculture. There had only been, at this point, one other aquaculture on the West Coast. Now, the marvelous thing about the Lummis is the Bureau of Indian Affairs was mad at them. With the exception of one or two marine biologists, nobody in the universities would talk to them because they all thought that they were lazy and unmotivated. Nobody in the foundations would talk to them, and nobody at the local county level would talk to them. So you had an Indian tribe that for once in its life was left alone. Nobody to give them any advice, nobody to talk them into making bolo ties or anything. Now it's 4 years later. The Lummies have created a 750-acre pond on their tidal flats. They've raised from government and private sources $5 million. Within 5 years, they will control oyster seed production in the Pacific Basin. They have upwards of 60 tribal members now trained as marine biologists. These people are able to take any kind of fish apart, tell you exactly what it's made of, what its problems are, how you can adapt it freshwater to saltwater and back. They're raising 20 million oysters every 4 months. They've converted freshwater Donaldson trout to seawater. They're able to take them back and forth. They're now going all over the South Seas to the atolls as advisors on the aquaculture. Bureau of Indian Affairs came out and took one look at the Lummie project. They said, well, you guys got away from us, but we'll get you back under the fold sooner or later, and we're never going to let another tribe get away with what you got away with. And consequently, as we talk about social issues in the 70s, that is the type of reaction our best projects have gotten. That's the type of attitude that we've had to face. A large reason why we had Alcatraz and the activist events is because we have been dealing with an American society that does not think for itself. Therefore, we, like other minority groups, had to go out and find a symbol that would be easy for people to identify with, to be able to sway the public opinion, to be able to change the conditions and policies that were affecting us. There are a lot of specific things that can and should be done in Indian affairs. Before I close, I'm going to name 3 or 4 projects that we desperately need help on. But these are short-term projects. These are easy political things. These are things where you are not required to think, you're not required to meditate, you're not required to examine your own values. All you're required to do is write letters, gain adherence to the cause, develop political pressure. But the situation in the United States is getting so serious, not in terms of revolution. And I said this some years ago at Oswego, and all of the long hairs booed me because revolution was popular. But I thought at that time, and I still think at this time, America is going to bore itself to death before it does anything else. Because it seems to me that we have a conglomerate of people who either cannot or will not examine the fundamental principles upon which they make their decisions, upon which they place their values. It seems to me this stems directly back to your religious heritage. Your religion preaches that you have faith, which in a practical context means you believe what we tell you and you don't question it. And I think that's been drummed into Western man, into Christian man, for so long that all he can do at the present time is react. All you have to do is wave a symbol in front of him and he jumps. It can be a cross, an American flag, a black fist, a dollar bill, whatever it is. It seems to me that we're not going, no matter how much social movement we get in, no matter how many new groups we organize, no matter how many presidential candidates we support, until there's a fundamental re-examination of the premises upon which people make their decisions, of how they view the universe, how they view human beings, how they view their relationship to other forms of life, how they review their communities. All we're going to see is a continual spin, spin, spin. And the unfortunate thing is I think whether American Indians are ready to take the responsibility or not, the only people standing in the way of a total intellectual collapse of American society are those traditional Indian people who say, no, the universe is not dead. I, as an Indian holy man, can talk to trees and rocks. If you would get off your jet planes and go out there and listen, the rocks would talk to you and you could talk with them. The people who, from the traditional religions, who say you cannot kill the coyotes, you cannot kill these species, as bad as a species may appear to human beings, it was created by the same creator who created the rest of us, and it has an inherent right to live whether we want it to live or not. And I think that point of view is the only point of view that is truly philosophically and religiously raised as an alternative to what we see in the United States today. Whether American Indian people want to accept this responsibility or not, a certain percentage of them are going to have to speak out and say these things. No matter how much your cemeteries mean to you in terms of your religion, there's a fundamental question of how your cemeteries say what you are. That through your whole lives and even after death, you could not relate to the land that you lived on. Even after you were dead, your relatives were afraid to give you to that land. And consequently, by what right do you call it your land? Only by the right that you have guns at the present time to keep it. But your spirits are not there, your bones are not there, and you are not there. And I think all of these issues are going to be raised in one way or another in the next 5 years. The thing that I greatly fear, the irrationality of the white man who is asked to think about the way he makes his decisions. I've tried to raise this question in a number of contexts where there were Christian clergymen who had doctor's degrees in theology, apparently educated men who could examine alternatives. And all I got was either an irrational response that I was going to hell. And listen, if I had to play harps with Billy Graham and Orville Roberts endlessly, I'd go to hell. All those guys down at the Cotton Bowl don't realize what they signed up for, let me tell you that. And if Chris Christopherson thinks he's going to write those kind of songs in heaven, he's got another thought. But I think that these are really the fundamental questions that have to be raised. Indians have to raise them, and those of you who are post-Christian or non-Christian or quasi-Christian have got to raise these questions in your universities, in your schools, in every way you can. Now, I would predict a very, very exciting 5 years coming up, more so than perhaps anything happening in the 50s and 60s. In 1950, a book called Worlds in Collision was published by Emanuel Velikovsky. The academic establishment turned on this man and ripped him to shreds. Went so far as to write predictions that the man was crazy and that if his theory was right, they said if Emanuel Velikovsky's theory is right, Venus would have to be 800 degrees in temperature. Well, 12 years later, they found out it was. One of your friends from the Harvard astronomical group there said that Emanuel Velikovsky is crazy. If he's right, the sun has, I think it's a positive charge of 10 to the 19th power. And 3 or 4 years later, an Australian astronomer proved that the sun had a positive charge of 10 to the 19th power. What Immanuel Velikovsky did was take the religious myths and folklore of people all over the globe that described certain types of celestial phenomena. A lot of this phenomenon were cloaked in what had been regarded very superstitious pagan legends, that a bird and a dragon fought and that all of these things happened. And he showed that the solar system we live in is hardly a stable solar system, that Jupiter is in all probability a star, that this star ejected Venus as a comet, and that Venus nearly hit the Earth several times, and that what you have described in the Bible, in Exodus, the fall of Jericho, all of these things were actual events that people witnessed and lived through. I mention this because on the West Coast, students have taken up the cause of this man, and all they've asked is for the people in the universities to give him a hearing, not for anybody to lose their scholarly reputation by supporting the theory, but simply to give it a hearing. I've talked with some of the best archaeologists in Colorado, and they gave me a very scientific statement. They said I would not read the man because he's crazy. And I said, well, how do you know he's crazy unless you've read it? And they said, well, anybody who would write anything like that must be crazy. And I said, anything like what? Because you admit that you haven't read the book. They said, well, we wouldn't read anything like that. And I think that, again, all relates back to the situation we face today. I'm terribly disappointed at the avant-garde Christian theologians that couldn't see that if the Bible incidents were true, this put their religion on a very high plane. I was very disappointed until 2 days ago in Chicago when I brought this up to an Episcopalian. I thought I would have a lot of chance to communicate with an Episcopalian because they're very liberal people. They believe that the knots in the Ten Commandments were later additions by conservatives. And this guy in particular was a very high church liberal man. And he told me that religiously, even if the idea was correct, that they could not consider it because this would place all of the creation stories of the various religions on an equal basis and would do away with the Christian doctrine of creation. And I said, you should be most thankful for Immanuel Velikovsky, because somebody ought to do away with the Christian doctrine of creation, because that's why we're in the mess that we're in. And consequently, I have no doubts in my own mind that this man's theory is going to carry the remaining decades of this century, that he's going to open up all of the sciences, even pseudosciences like anthropology. That he's going to give us a new vision of what the experiences of mankind were. Now, one of the fundamental opening points that has blocked Indian religions from being considered as valid tribal, valid religions for mankind is the Indian creation stories, the Navajo, the Hopi, the Mandan. All of them refer to a world catastrophe where the people survived underground and then a friendly spiritual being showed them the way to the next world. And when you put these legends in the cosmology of this man, religion becomes an entirely different thing. And each religion must stand on its ability to produce something today and not on a foreordained idea of history. We have systematically issued a challenge to Christians and other religions. If they can go out to Arizona, and after the Hopis have made it rain, if they can get down on their knees and dry it up, they get equal time. If they can't, and we know they can't, then they've got to step back and listen. And I think these are a number of very serious issues that we're confronted with today. They're entirely different than the issues that we've had to face in the 60s, entirely different than the issues in 1968, and different than political issues today. They require the same seriousness, the same examination, the same thoughtfulness, the same commitment. If we don't do that and undertake a complete examination of all the values and fundamental beliefs of Western civilization and judge them on their merits, we are going to continue to have American presidents who are against abortion because they believe in the sanctity of human life and who can continue a war in Southeast Asia for 4 years and call both those actions Christian and see no schizophrenia in that type of belief. And I think those are the issues we've got to deal with, whether you like it or not. It's my belief that eventually you will have to confront and make a choice between traditional Western values, traditional values of American Indian tribes, and their conception of life. And so I think we are your opponents for the next decade. And I think we're going to win.